side, and French, English, Irish, and Scottish on my dad's side. And I've been a very grateful visitor here on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people for over 15 years now, and feel very fortunate to the community members, the elders, the knowledge keepers who have guided me in how to be respectful, how to walk on these territories, and how to build a relationship, not only with the people, but with the land, with the waters, and with the animals in this place. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Hello to those online. I just wanted to take this opportunity to start us off in a good way by inviting Diane Sam to welcome us to the territory.
Osamna Shtelicha, Haichka Gonzana Techa Lekwungen Tanu, Swilak Thanisne, Chisales and Lekwungen Iahausit. Good morning, everybody. I just introduced myself and welcome you to the Lekwungen territory of the Songhees and the Esquimalt people. I would like to share some words that my Uncle Skip often shares, is that doing protocol and welcoming people to our territory is not a new thing. That often we would have our safe haven place would be at the Inner Harbor, closer to the Empress Hotel, is that would be where we would welcome canoes in and make sure that people were coming in good faith. Just wanted to share that. So, and then also it would typically be an elder doing this work, and I'm definitely not an elder. But we have a language program. We have an initiative at Songhees where they said that if you feel bold enough and comfortable enough to do that, feel free to step forward. And also I am the cultural protocol liaison here at the First Peoples House as well, so it also falls under my job description as well. So enjoy your day, and Haichka.
Miigwech Diane, Haichka, for welcoming us here today. Back again to say hello and welcome to those online joining us, to take care of some little pieces for those of you who are here in this ceremonial hall with us today. If you don't know, the bathrooms are through the doors down the hall. And for those of you at home, I hope you know where your washrooms are, because I can't help you with that. So the cameras will be kind of up here, so if you aren't comfortable being on film, just make sure you stay over there. We will be including questions later, but we're going to start by having some words by Dr. John Burrows and Dr. Sarah Morales, who will share with us a little bit about the program, what a transsystemic classroom is like. We're also going to then move into a Q&A with Sarah and John. We'll have a bit of a coffee break. We have some students here. We have our admissions team here. So after the coffee break, we'll hear from the admissions team about what you need to get into the program, a little bit more about the supports we have in the Faculty of Law for all students, particularly for Indigenous students as well. And then we'll get into another Q&A after that. So without further ado, I'd like to ask John Burrows to the podium.
Buju Nidinwe Magani Dok, Niji Nishnabeg Nich Marzig, Bangi Etago Ninata Nishnabem, Ingagudi Tunjishna Mayan, Giganos Nindijnakas, Neashi Winegaming and Donjaba, Nigigan Dodem. Welcome. I'm grateful to be here with you today, all my relations. My name is Giganos, which is the name of my third great-grandfather and the name that I carry today. I am of the Otter clan, Nigig and Dodem, and I'm from Neashi Winegaming, which is the Cape Croker Indian Reserve on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario. And I'm really delighted that you're here and that we're able to learn from one another in this beautiful space. In the short time that I have, I want to talk about 5 things. What is law? Why would we want to understand and teach and learn Indigenous law? Why the University of Victoria is a place to do that? How we go about teaching Indigenous law in terms of the structure of our program, and who is coming to and who we hope to continue to join us here at the University of Victoria Law School. What is law? Law is a set of standards, principles, and criteria for making decisions. It is the signposts and guideposts and evaluative understandings that we draw upon in regulating our affairs, resolving our disputes. So law is criteria, standards, authority, precedent, signpost, guideposts, things that we look to by way of analogy to make decisions and regulate our affairs. This understanding of law would see parliaments as important and legislatures as important in identifying for us the ways that we might regulate our affairs and resolve our dispute, what those principles and processes are that are necessary as we make our way through life. Then you have lawyers that help draft the pieces of legislation and judges that are involved in interpreting that legislation with lawyers' help. And then you have enforcement of these laws in many different ways. But the definition of law that I gave would say that what legislatures, parliaments, lawyers, courts, police officers do is only a part of our legal system. Law is something you do. It's something you participate in, and you participate in it broadly. And so when we think about law from that perspective, then it also flows from human interaction. And in particular, when we're thinking about this in an Indigenous context, law flows from Indigenous communities that have place and space and their own sensibilities around, or their own normativity around what is authoritative, what's precedential, what's a standard that's appropriate, what are criteria that we should use in following patterns that create a measure of predictability, a measure of orderliness within an Indigenous context. So law flows from Indigenous communities, and those laws have been here for millennia. They were here prior to the arrival of Europeans, and they are here today. And so part of our challenge is to find ways that those principles of criteria, authority, precedents, standards, signposts, guideposts, processes for making decisions can be brought more fully to the attention of students and communities and governments and corporations and others, because our laws as Indigenous peoples need to be a part of the broader Canadian ways that we make decisions, regulate our affairs, resolve our disputes, and they need to be revitalized and see a resurgence within our communities as Indigenous peoples, so that we look primarily to those laws when we're faced with challenges or conflicts around child welfare, intellectual property, resource use, title, criminal justice, environmental law, securities law, corporate law, administrative law, labor relations. Indigenous peoples have law and can create law that deal with all of these areas of life. And sometimes the challenges that we face at home around colonialism and racism and lateral violence will be attenuated or better processed or dealt with if we can do so in ways that draw upon what's legitimate to us, rather than having things imposed on us that don't draw out the persuasiveness and the deliberation and the respect that we should expect of one another within our communities. And then when we deal with other communities, we can go into those spaces with a well-identified understanding of how to carry ourselves and how to carry those laws that are a part of our people with great respect. Canada is then a multi-juridical country. We have the common law across the country. In English-speaking Canada, we have the civil law in Quebec, and then we have Indigenous law that exists in other places. But there is no other place in Canada where Indigenous law is being offered as a degree alongside the common law. In fact, this is the first time this has occurred in the world. And so to teach Indigenous law alongside the common law is to convey the reality of Canadian law, its creativity and its complexity, and to provide accessibility for students in understanding our law in its broader context and its deeper ways. So why might you think about doing this at UVic? Why have we done this at UVic? Well, we've been working on this since 1995, if not before, 2001. I came to this school 2004. We really developed this notion that we need to support students while they're here. So our colleague Heather Raven in 1992 became the Director of Academic and Cultural Support. We have a program of academic and cultural support since that time. We developed a suite of specialized courses dealing with Indigenous legal issues, both internally and with relationship to the Canadian state through time. We offered a law degree in the Arctic called a Kitsarak, where we graduated students who were primarily Inuktitut speaking and took seriously their laws and teaching in that program. We have the National Consortium for Indigenous Economic Development between the law and the business school. We work on economies as sustainable, economies that connect to Indigenous people's own laws and values. We have many professors who are Indigenous or who are working on these issues as non-Indigenous allies that are supporting us, including two chairs, my chair, the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law, and then my colleague Val Napoleon, who teaches as the Law Foundation Chair in Indigenous Governance. We also have a grad program that involves numerous people coming to UVic to study Indigenous law and have had experience before coming to UVic in Indigenous law that students get to participate in. We have the Indigenous Law Research Unit, where we work with more than 40 communities across the country, helping them to revitalize their laws at their invitation. We are also writers and activists and scholars, and we participate in the field in many, many different ways. So how is Indigenous law taught at the University of Victoria? Well, there are 2 degrees. You get at the end a JID, a Juris Indigenous Doctorate, and a JD, a Juris Doctorate. And so you learn both about Indigenous law and the common law as you come through the program over 4 years. It's a cohort-based program, meaning you start with a group of students and you continue in the 4 years alongside those students, although beginning in second year you begin to interact more fully with the broader law school, as also happens in first year in legal process and law, legislation, and policy, and in the social side of the school. The classes in our first and second year are taught transsystemically, which means we teach them multi-juridically, which means that we teach the common law and Indigenous legal traditions in comparison and contrast with one another. So I teach a constitutionalism course, and that course involves me teaching about Anishinaabe constitutionalism, the law of the peoples that are Algonquian speaking around the Great Lakes from Quebec through Saskatchewan and beyond, including Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. At the same time I'm teaching that, I'm also teaching about Canadian federalism, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When you walk out of my class, you might get a course in criminal law, laws dealing with harms that are identified by a state or a governmental body, and so you would learn the criminal law statute, of what are the legal processes in criminal law, what are the elements of an offense, what are the defenses in criminal law, but all the while that's occurring, you will be learning this in the context of Cree law as well from my colleague David Millward. And that happens through the entire year. Then you step out of that class and you might get a class with Val Napoleon, who's teaching property law or land law. And so you learn about mortgages and easements and real and personal property, but all along the way you're also getting introduced to Gitsan law. The feast system and the house system and the clan system and the way that those folks, that nation, relates to land and property. And then in the upper years, you will get courses in voluntary and involuntary obligations, or tort law and contract law, but tort law will be intermingled perhaps with Hulkaminum or Salish law, and contract law will be intermingled all along the way with Silcotin law. And so through the first couple of years, you get what's conventionally offered in a common law legal frame being decentered from its common law legal frame and trying to understand these ideas, these approaches from Indigenous legal traditions. There'll be some courses also in third and fourth year and second year as well that will be transsystemic. We're still growing our cohort. We're only our second year in, but courses in administrative law could be taught transsystemically, family law, business associations. It will depend on the year and the people that are able to teach, but we'll also have other courses in the classroom after that fashion. The other part is that there are 2 field courses that you will take during your 4 years, and that when you're enrolled in those field courses, that will be all you do during that semester. That is, you will be immersed in a community setting, learning and applying, say, Hulkaminum law, Stolo law, whatever the communities are that we're working with Saanich law, as we've done here in the past with JD students. And you have about a month at the beginning on the land, and then you work 2 by 2 in projects that are given to us by the community that we use both Indigenous law and Canadian law to try to help them answer those questions using the internal as well as external legal resources for that point. And then at the end, you come together and you learn vicariously from one another about what those projects were. And so if I was working on issues of title, when we come together at the end, I would get to learn about issues of child and family assistance, or environmental responsibility and sustainability. And so the courses can operate in that way in that field school setting. We also anticipate another field school model would be to start again in a common way and then send students out 2 by 2 across the world. So that 2 students might be working in Geneva, and 2 students might be working with a Maori legal community in New Zealand, or 2 students might be working with the Innu or the Mi'kmaq or the Blackfoot or the Inuit or the Anishinaabe. And so we have different models of field schools that can happen after that way of proceeding. This is to build both a practical approach that is service-oriented and is trying to understand the needs of the law from the community perspectives. It's also enables engagement which is reflective, that you yourself get to figure out what you are going to do as you walk off into the sunset with your 2 degrees from the University of Victoria, being ready to work with Indigenous communities because of the humility that you've been exposed to, understanding the complexity of these different legal traditions, at the same time being fully qualified to article and get called to the bar and work in any common law jurisdiction in Canada. Our goal is not just to produce excellence in relationship to serving Indigenous communities through their laws, but also to create excellent common law lawyers. In fact, we hope that our common law legal education is even a little step above what might be received in other places, because you learn the common law in its cultural context. And you see where decisions might be made that might be unquestioned by folks that just go through the common law without understanding a competing or a contrasting or a parallel point of view. And with that contrast in your common law legal education, when you sit in a firm or you're working with government or you're working with a community and asked to apply the common law, you're going to be doing so with a critical mind, with a fuller menu or toolkit or set of possibilities that you bring to that activity. So I've talked about what is law, why Indigenous law, why do this at UVic, how do we teach this, who should be here, who is here, people from all walks of life. It is designed to have a majority of Indigenous students in the class, but we expect a substantial number of non-Indigenous peoples to also participate, because this is something that you can learn, and it's something that there are invitations that are offered from communities to learn this alongside their own members and Indigenous peoples from other nations. And it is the point to be able to engage together in dialogue with different points of view, both constructively and critically, to create standards, principles, criteria, authority, precedent, signposts, guideposts for regulating our affairs, helping us better our behavior and resolve our disputes in ways that are persuasive and not done through colonialism, racism, duress, force, but through deliberation, discussion, respect, understanding. This is the reason why we invite people from all walks of life to come to the University of Victoria and learn both about the common law and Indigenous law. Miigwech bizinuig mi you ahau. Thank you.
Miigwech, John, for beautifully packaging up the program. I'm so glad that we have this recording right now. So I'll also pass the mic over to Sarah, who's going to give you all a little taste of what it would be like. John's really talked about how they take up common law and transsystemic laws, so different legal orders in the classroom. And Sarah's going to speak to the significance of place in the Coast Salish world, and you'll all get a little taste of what it is like to be in one of these classrooms. So Sarah.
Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in beautiful Coast Salish territory. I'm grateful for the words of my friend and colleague. I think every morning is a good morning if it starts with listening to John. So I'm grateful for that today. As Ruth said, my name is Sarah Morales. My Hulkaminam name is Satahuya. I'm Coast Salish, a member of Cowichan tribes. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to you all this morning about the JD program and share a little bit about what transsystemic learning may look like in that classroom. When I started working in this field of Indigenous law, I very early on began to realize that research is as much about our unanswered or our unquestioned answers as it is about our unanswered questions. And so this morning, I hope to illustrate, drawing on some examples from the community that I am from, how a transsystemic approach can help us not only answer are questions about Indigenous law, but also help us think about our unquestioned answers around law and what law is and what comprises law. So I'm going to show some pictures to help me talk about this today. So Stalnip is a word that my elders have described to me as meaning where we are, and really it refers to our territory. And as I've engaged in thinking and writing and working with Indigenous law, I'm often reminded about the significance of place within our legal tradition. And this place here that you see is very significant to me individually. When I'm home at my parents' house on the reserve in Cowichan Bay, this is what I see when I look out the window. And this mountain in the background is Mount Zuhalem, or Peepom, as my elders have shared with me. And Peepom means little swelled up one. And it's named that because during the Great Floods, when our people took refuge on the side of the mountain, as the waters began to swell, you could see a frog, a swelled up frog in the side of the mountain. And our elders say people with good eyes can still see that now. And so when I'm home in my territory and I'm looking around and I'm thinking of these places, I'm reminded of the words of my elders and my friends and the teachings that I've received. And I wanted to share the words of one of my dear friends and former colleagues, late Cowichan Tribes member Joey Caro, and he said this to me, quote, "We look at Mount Zuhalem and we see the basking frog in the flood story. We see the mouth of the Cowichan River and we see the whale and the thunderbird fighting. We see the stone heads over by the Comiekan Church. We see all the legends and battles and stories that have happened, and old village sites and burial sites, and our history is interwoven into this land. This is our home. This is us. We are it. This is home for us. We can't go to Ireland and feel that. We can't even go to Nisga'a territory and feel that. This is it here," end quote. And this is true for me. These mountains, these rivers, these sea creatures, these eagles, these cedar trees, these ocean waves, they all represent the sights and sounds and smells that characterize my home, my sense of place. And they remind me of my obligations, not only to the territory, but to my ancestors, to my future generations, and to my kin and community that surrounds me. Now, when I shift my view from my parents' house or look 45 degrees east, I see a different reminder of a past of my people. The landscape of my territory also reflects this overlay of settler colonialism. And this also influences my experience of being home. I drive through the reserve and I can smell the pollution. I can see the big boats coming into the harbor. I can see the polluted shellfish harvesting areas. I can smell the stench of sewer. I can see the stone monument at Hackett Park that memorials when the gunboats came to the shores during this period of colonialism. And so just as the landscape reminds me of who I am and my connection to this place and the laws of my Coast Salish people, it also reminds me of this history, of this settler colonialism, of the laws that have continued to impact my community and how that has changed our landscape and our relationship to this territory. And it's somewhere in between these two realities that I experience my territory and my obligations, my legal obligations today. So I've thought about this. How does place, which really serves as a legal textbook for my people, the land, how does that help us think about living in this multi-juridical world? So as a Coast Salish person, and I would say arguably for most Indigenous people, place is at the center of most of our relationships, okay? Our sense of place runs through our expressions of property, runs through our traditional economies, runs through our intra and inter-community relations, runs through our kinship systems. And these places that are of importance to us range in scale. Some can be as small as a boulder or a sacred bathing site, and others can be as large as a mountainside or territory. And these sites are deeply imbued with meaning and with history and with laws of obligation that deeply influence both our personal and our community identity. There is a strong connection between law and land and identity within our communities. And so as Indigenous people, and for me more specifically as a Hul'qumi'num Mistimuth, as a Hul'qumi'num person, it's the land and the environment that we come from that we believe make us who we are. As my Uncle George Harris shared with me, quote, he said, "I want to let you know that when I speak from my heart, for my nation and for my people. The land is an inheritance that I received from our ancestors. Part of that inheritance includes the traditions and sacred and ceremonial rites that go with our land and our culture. I want to speak from the perspective of an Indigenous person of this land. I come from this land. My ancestors come from this land. I am now a living being for this generation, but my ancestors are connected to the land, and I appreciate what they've given me and what they've left behind for us. You cannot separate land and culture," end quote. And so, as illustrated by the two previous perspectives of Cowichan Bay that I shared with you, my territory has been imprinted not only by our own Hul'qumi'num laws, but also by colonial laws and Canadian laws. And as a result, both legal traditions have deeply impacted our societies, our identities, and our relations with each other and the natural world. So this mountain in the background is Mount Prevost. And I want to share a story about how this mountain is a source of law for our people, because it helps me to illustrate to you the relationship between physical and legal space within the Hul'qumi'num world. And oftentimes, that's best illustrated by thinking back to our first ancestor stories, which are a source of law within our community. So the following extract from a Cowichan first ancestor story illustrates a typical series of events. So I'll quote this. Before there was anybody, and long before the Great Flood had swept through the Cowichan world, there appeared 12 separate human beings who fell from the heavens to populate the pristine and untouched wilderness. The very first skyman that was sent plummeting to the earth was a gifted soul by the name of Sialitsa. After Sialitsa fell to the warm ground of Cowichan near present-day Coxsila Ridge, his younger brother Stutson next appeared from the heavens, landing between the two majestic peaks of Swahas, also known as Mount Prevost. There soon followed a succession of other first Cowichans, who founded the present-day Cowichan tribes. Among them were the following: Sahilton, who descended to the site marked by the Quamachin Big House; Swetus, who was sent down at Mount Newton in neighboring Saanich Peninsula; and Sweatin, who when he fell from the sky stood on a massive heaven-sent boulder that thundered when it collided with the earth. So this, to us, if you look at this as though it's the profile of an individual, we believe this is our ancestor Stetson as he fell to the earth. And these stories, there's many life stories or journeying stories that go along with each of these first ancestors. They are a source of many laws within the Hulkaminam world. So laws around property, for example. When these first ancestors fell, they fell carrying with them sacred ceremonial materials, rattles, masks, names. Individuals within our communities who can connect themselves to those first ancestors through our traditional names and our family lineage then have rights to that sacred ceremonial materials. And there are legal processes which enable the passing down of those materials and regulate that. There's also laws that derive around regulating the physical space where those first ancestors dropped. So communities and individuals who can connect themselves to these 12 first ancestors in their various places where they fell around the Cowichan Valley then have certain access and resource harvesting rights to those areas that others do not have. I've even heard in some of my discussion with elders that these stories provide a framework for relationships in and between communities, depending on how our first ancestors interacted or experiences they had with other first ancestors. And I share this to show that although I have said that our laws have been deeply influenced, and sometimes hidden by colonial law, these laws and these legal practices and processes still exist within communities. Me and a colleague of mine, Brian Tom, have talked about sort of a long shadow that has been cast by Canadian law that has sometimes distorted our vision of Indigenous law, hidden it from some time, but our laws continue to exist underneath those laws, and they were not erased by these colonial processes. So the goal of a transsystemic approach, as John so eloquently stated, is to really help people see this, right? To bring Indigenous laws out of the shadows and to illustrate its use in resolving legal disputes within the Canadian legal system today. John often speaks about the fact that we need to learn and draw on Indigenous laws, not just to improve the lives and betterment of Indigenous peoples, but also that Indigenous law has a lot to teach the common law as well, that it's a dialogue that's going to go forward. So I want to share an example now of how this could be done using a dispute that occurred within my community. Okay, so this place here, this Tombolo Spit, this sandy area that connects Salt Spring Island to Walker's Hook is known as Sahaman in my community. And Sahaman means a place to catch up. It's a place within the oral tradition of the communities that I'm connected to where they speak about the fact that our neighboring communities would meet, would gather, harvest shellfish and fish and share stories, spend time together as they went about their travels in the Gulf Islands, and that it was also within our oral tradition a recognition that this was also a sacred burial site. So in the early 2000s, Sablefin Hatchery wanted to establish a commercial hatchery for sablefish in this area of Walker Hook. And they wanted to discharge the effluent, so the waste from the hatchery, through this Tombolo Spit. And so they went through the Canadian law process. They applied to the Ministry of Water, Land, and Air Protection, I believe it's called, and we're looking for drawing on the Waste Management Act and the Heritage Conservation Act, because there was a recorded ARC site here that was known, to ask permission to allow Indigenous, or allow the hatchery to pump effluent through this area. And when our community members found out about it, they tried to get a stop on the permit that was issued that would allow this variance. And they asked the Environmental Appeal Board to issue a stop to this type of development at Walker's Hook. Now, the Sablefin, the fish hatchery, said, okay, we recognize you say that this might be a sacred burial site, or this is an important place to your community. We'll do a little bit of digging to see if there's actually any truth to your oral traditions. And they started to do some digging. And the remains of 13 bodies were found in this area, which then triggered a greater archaeological assessment, where it was estimated that at least 700 and possibly as many as 1,500 ancestors of the Hul'qumi'num people were buried in this site. And so my elders were very much opposed to this happening. What they said is that this would essentially, allowing this permit would essentially allow sewage to be piped through a cemetery. They talked about the laws within our legal tradition that would prohibit this. So these are three of the elders who were instrumental in bringing this claim forward. That's Myris James on the far right, and then Laura and Augie Sylvester on the left. And they talked about the principle of respect within the Coast Salish world. And they talked about the fact that because of this legal principle, there are certain ways that we have to carry ourselves and conduct ourselves in these sacred spaces, in these places where our ancestors remain. And that could mean, some of them shared stories about remembering going there as a child and being told that you couldn't walk on that area, you couldn't cross over that area, or you couldn't go near that area during certain times of the day, and so forth. They also brought up this principle of reciprocity, talking about the obligations that they owe ancestors and continue to owe ancestors in their lifetime. So this included things like doing ceremonial burnings for these people. There's people who are trained within our community that if remains are touched or have to be moved, they are people with special training who can do that. But according to our laws, these are not places to be disturbed. We feel that there's very real spiritual and physical consequences that can come not only to the individual who does the disturbance, but also the family of them. So this is a strict law within our community. The arguments that were brought forward by the Sablefin hatchery demonstrated just this differing in worldviews. It became apparent that they were classifying this burial site as an archaeological site that had value for scientific reasons, versus the fact of our community who deemed this to be of utmost importance because we owed obligation to these people as our kin relations, and we saw it as instrumental to our own identity and cultural identity. So we see that difference here. I'm just providing a brief snapshot and not going into too much detail, but you see where Hul'qumi'num law would have not permitted this based on how the issue was classified under Canadian common law, it would have permitted a variance of the site. We also, the community members also made arguments about our obligations to the natural world. So again, drawing on these principles of respect and reciprocity, we see that we have certain obligations that create standards and processes in place for how we maintain the natural world around us. So we had obligations to that place, we had obligations to the water, we had obligations to the shellfish harvesting area, we had obligations to the fish that surrounded that to ensure their longevity and continuance, right? We recognize that we are in a reciprocal relationship with the natural world, that just as the flora and fauna give to us, we also have responsibilities and obligations that create standards and practices for how we have to treat and regulate those areas. Okay, so I always, when I give this lecture, I always tell my students, okay, based on this evidence, who do you think was successful in this? Okay, and this year in first year, I had a big chunk of optimistic students who thought 1,500 bodies for sure, right? This would not have been allowed to go forward. But unfortunately, it was, okay? In finding for sable fin and allowing the site alteration permit, the ministry talked about the fact that there was no irreparable harm to human health or the environment if the stay was denied. So they said the levels of the effluent aren't so bad. You can still, eat the fish, you can still harvest the shellfish and eat it. It won't necessarily affect it. So we're going to permit that. And they said that there would be no harm to the cultural deposits. Okay, and what they were saying there is that there would be like no denigration, or the effluent wouldn't cause them to decay quicker in any way. They also talked about the fact that although it had been used as a burial site, there was evidence from at least 4,500 years ago to 500 years ago. They said within the last 500 years, no one's been buried there, so you're not using it. Not recognizing that this is a place where we still went to maintain a cultural connection to those ancestors and to perform our legal obligations to those ancestors and renew our relationships with them, okay? You just see the classification of the issues and the standards and legal processes used to determine that issue just so differing between the Coast Salish legal tradition and the common law or Canadian legal tradition. One of our elders, in speaking about this to us afterwards, said, quote, "The Canadian laws that permitted the approval are in direct confrontation with the laws of the Hulkaminam people." Okay? And that is, for a lot of our communities, the reality that we are currently living in. Our law prohibits us from acting in a certain way or obliges us to act in a certain way. But oftentimes, those legal processes or those obligations are in direct confrontation with the Canadian legal system. And so where does that leave us? How do we work through this together? And that, I think, is what is the beauty and the importance and the hope of this transsystemic program. Because through it, our students gain a greater, deeper understanding of Indigenous law and that it exists and how to work with and through it, which puts them in conversation with the common law, where they are then able to see nexuses where these two legal traditions can dialogue and have conversations and draw on the strengths of one another to work through these issues. Oh, sorry, I'm on the quote. So I want to end just sort of with these quotes that I think give me so much hope. I always say these are two of my most favorite legal scholars, and they've really influenced my thinking about this topic. So the first is the former Chief Justice Finch of the BC Court of Appeal, and in the CLE, Continuing Legal Education, keynote address that he gave in 2012 to a room packed full of lawyers, he said, quote, "The court's judgment in Delgamuukw concluded with the words, 'Let us face it, we are all here to stay.' True enough, but if in the face of this reality we are to find space for multiple legal orders to coexist, and if we are ultimately to achieve an equal reconciliation, we must recognize that to stay must also be to learn." And I think that is what is so important about programs like the JD, JID, and other classes of Indigenous law within law schools across the university, that it is providing students an opportunity to engage with and learn Indigenous law and recognize that they have a duty to do that. The other is a former Cowichan elder, my grandfather, Angus Smith. And he, in one of my conversations with him before he passed, said, quote, "When I'm sitting here all by myself, I often wonder who is going to carry all this work for us to make things right." And then he was talking to me a little bit, and he said, "But somebody's got to be there to help her, help our people with this kind of work because we need it." And I love that. My grandfather was a huge proponent of the fact that we needed to really seriously engage with our Coast Salish laws, with our Hulkaminam laws. But he didn't see it as just a Hulkaminam issue or a Coast Salish issue. He recognized that in order to effect real change, in order to really push Canada and our Canadian societies to meet their potential, to really foster and grow this legal system of which we're all a part of, that we all needed to be involved in this conversation, helping and working with each other. So it is why it is an honor for me to be a part of this program, to teach with these beautiful and amazing colleagues, to learn from these legal traditions, to get to connect with these communities, and to work with these students who I think will really be imperative in implementing this and moving Canada forward on this great project. So I thank you all for your time today. Haichkasiam.
Miigwech, Sarah, for that pretty amazing example for each of us to feel like we were in one of those classrooms with the JD program. So at this time, we're going to open the floor and the internet to questions. I would like to remind you that any questions in regards to admissions, if we can save them till after we have presentations from the admissions team after our little break. But if anyone has questions for John or Sarah, please go ahead with those now. Nice awkward pause. We have one up there. Do we have someone with a mic? Thanks, Sam.
Hi, my name is Doris. I'm working with First Nations in the Yukon. My background is German. My children are First Nation German. My daughter is interested in this program, myself too. I wished I would be in a position to come back to school and learn about these things, because I'm working on land and resource-related issues, and the challenges we're facing in bringing comments forward from the First Nation in response to resource application, land applications. The criteria they're looking at are so restricted, and the understanding of the importance of Indigenous views and laws is so limited. It's a challenge. It's just ongoing and frustrating. My question for you guys is, I work with Tlingit First Nation, and they seem to have a, because of their relations to the coast and the stability they had in like hundreds of years ago, not having the annual round as much as interior First Nations, they seem to have a better sense of their traditions and place, not necessarily place is the wrong word, but traditions. Whereas when I look on interior First Nations, maybe it's my external view just as not being within the First Nation, but it seems to be not as prevalent, and the history that was, or the traditions that were there. Like, I don't know how much knowledge there really is in terms of Indigenous law. What is your guys' experience? Like, where are the First Nations that you're working with? And do you think there is an equal representation in the First Nations of coastal versus interior First Nations? And maybe even Southern versus Northern First Nations?
Thank you for that wonderful question. It is the case that communities have been differentially impacted as a result of their location and the experiences that they've had with the cities and towns and people that surround them. And it might be tempting to then make a comparison saying that these folks are better or worse in terms of their, or stronger or weaker in terms of their ability to learn and practice Indigenous law today and in the future. And there is no question that power has to be taken into account in that sort of comparative mode. But we try not to engage in comparison, and we try to look on the face of each community and challenge that's presented to us, and we inevitably find that there are principles and processes within that community that can be drawn upon to help them answer the questions that they're facing. And it is hard in some instances to recognize that law isn't something that just comes from the past, although it does. Law is something that has to, at some level, be rooted in the culture, experience, history, genealogy, as it were, of the community. But law also is something that's a very contemporary practice too. And so some communities might be very strongly evangelical Christian. And in that instance, that tradition might interact with ideas that flow from creation stories or language or place-based practices. And so what we're not looking for is a purity of a once upon a time, what it might have been like 500 years before the introduction of other traditions. It's how in this place and time do these communities take what's available to them and create legitimate processes that engage their citizenry, that are respectful and responsive to all of the needs that they have. And in some instances, communities will shade the weight that they put on their traditions to something that was prior to the arrival of Europeans. At other instances, that prior to the arrival of Europeans dimension will be there, but their emphasis might be more to look to administrative law and create some of the principles of fairness and transparency and notice and hearing that flow from maybe a board approach or a co-management approach to the circumstances. And so we start with the idea not of deficiency, but of resilience. And with that resilience, you can then find resources within any community to get folks together to develop their laws that have all sorts of different sources attached to them.
We have a question from...
So if you're wondering what we're doing over here, we're monitoring what's going on online. So there's some more practical questions that I'd like to put out to John and Sarah. Here's the first one. What's the ratio of class time to reading time?
Do you
I
both
said
wanna
practical.
stand up here and share? Just so that you're both on.
Okay, I mean, depending on the day and the mood I'm in, I guess, maybe it changes a bit. But I try to do at least 25 pages for 1 hour of class time. So 3 hours a week would yield about 60 pages. It also depends if it's a case versus a secondary source, if it's a number of stories from the community. It's evolving.
So there are 4 hours a week of constitutional law class time, and I would expect that the students would put 8 hours in preparation for those 4 hours of class time, so that there would be double the time outside the class as to inside the class. And that ratio, I think, helps students then to be prepared to think about constitutional law as being about 12 hours a week in that mix.
Thank you. I have a few more if nobody else wants to jump in. Okay, here's the next one. How are students evaluated in your classes?
Okay, so evaluation will be dependent on the type of class that's offered. So with the field schools, for instance, when we've offered those in the past through the JD program, a part of that mark is participation, showing up every day and being prepared to listen to the leaders, the elders, the speakers that come as we're on an island or a beach or a mountaintop, in a forest, that you're fully engaged and there. And so there would be a participation mark as a part of that. There was also a journaling component to that, so that once a week you might create a reflective engagement online with what you learned, and you would send that out to your colleagues, and you might react to one another in your reflections, or just take what you learned during the week and put it out there to the others that surround you. And that writing assignment would also be a part of the evaluation. Then there was a memo or a project that was expected to be produced for the community, and you would be graded on that. And that sometimes took the form of like a coffee table book of Wissahickon Law. Other students put together curriculum for grade 11 students about how Wissahickon Law would be taught in the high schools. Other students put together a legal memo dealing with the Parks Canada and how Parks Canada's work could be enhanced if they took account of Wissahickon Law in that instance. A couple of students worked with the restoration of a site that had been degraded by a cement plant near Bouchard Gardens. And so they actually went and they pulled invasive species, and they spoke with the community as that was happening, and they took some of the native species that were at the school, and they were involved in the transplant of those species back to the site. And so there's kind of a hands-on component there, and that was a part of the way, and then there was a little story written about that, and the evaluation occurred in that front. So something was produced for the community, and then finally an academic paper was produced, something that might go into a continuing legal education conference, or into a law journal, or provide the basis for presentation that occurred when you come back to meet with your colleagues. So many types of forms of evaluation can occur when you're in those immersive settings. And then in the classroom,
So again, it depends on the subject in which you're teaching. I teach transsystemic enhancement to legal research and writing. So there's components there to help develop legal research and writing skills, whether it be a memo, a position paper, for negotiation prep exercise. Students did a policy brief that could be used. Some of my other classes, there's been case comments, just a variety, sort of depending on the subject matter of what I believe we'd use to evaluate. We also use exams to try and examine transsystemic learning.
And so one of the conventional ways that law schools engage in evaluation is in the 100% exam. And so in my class, at the end of the year, there's a 100% exam, but there's an exam that occurs in December, which is a help not hurt exam, which is worth 30% of the grade. And if you do better on that December exam than you do on the final exam, then that counts towards your final grade. If you do better on your final exam than in your December exam, then it's that last that counts. And so you can see that there's just a variety of mechanisms that we use, although exams, of course, are heavily a part of the evaluation cycle, and that also mirrors what happens when you get out of law school with bar admission course exams. And so there's a sense of preparation for that mode of engaging with the law as well.
There we go. Hi. Hi. I have one more question. Where did I write it here? Okay. Last one. What do you think the biggest challenges are in the classroom as a student?
So there'll be students here. For those that are present, they can talk about this at the break or perhaps after. But my sense of the challenges are there is a time management component. It's also emotional work as well as intellectual work, because the things that we're talking about are often happening in real time. And so the news isn't separate from the day-to-day lived experiences of many of the students, and some of our students actually get involved in those experiences. And so emotionally, there's a lot of hope and beauty and joy and inspiration that you carry emotionally along the way, which is uplifting and edifying. And sometimes I feel like we're walking on cloud nine, and that there's other moments of crushing pain and challenge that hurts to be there. And because we're dealing with areas of life where there's great disagreement, and where power is often arrayed against people who are vulnerable. And so being in the classroom has that challenge as a part of it. We do have supports at the university that help people through these questions, and we're helping students and they're helping one another to also be supportive as we work through the differences of opinion that are in the classroom too, right? You might expect to come to UVic and work in this degree and we'd all be on the same page, but people have different experiences, and those experiences themselves are learning, but there are also sometimes challenges to learning as well. And I have to say I've appreciated the students and the way they've worked through these issues. I don't want to sound overly I love the students and what they're doing, and I feel so grateful for them being present and being a part of my life. I'm a better person because of the students that come here, and I feel the struggle that's there, but I also just feel those chills up my spine because of the things that they're doing and the resilience and the work that they do to really try to make a difference day to day in the mundane, as well as the longer trajectory of change that I think this program is participating in.
Okay, are there any audience questions? Oh, great.
Hello, my name is Jason. I am a former student from here. I've lived in Victoria my whole life. I've grown up being a witness to many forms of systemic racism. And I came here in the interest of finding ways to deal with that, to gain tools of how to address that. I've had many different interactions with law, with social workers, with government types, where I don't feel heard, understood, or respected. in the whole reason I came here was to find hope and to gain tools. Like I said, is this the place for that? I guess is what I'm asking. You know, is this the place where you can come and develop a skill set where I can start addressing that for nephews and nieces that are going to be going through the same thing, or my children?
Yeah, I mean, this program, this place, these students, my colleagues, all make me very hopeful that things can change. And as John said, it's not because we all come with a similar viewpoint on every single issue, but that it's helping us develop ways of creating dialogues around hard issues to come to and recognizing strengths from both traditions that can be brought out into light. And this work is being picked up in communities where you can start to see recognition of Indigenous law and a drawing on Indigenous peoples as experts for issues that affect them, that I think is very hopeful. It's not to say that it's changing overnight or there's not still struggles or, you know, we're still striving to carve out equal space for Indigenous law, but I definitely think that this is the start.
I also feel hope, but I want to also emphasize I feel sadness, I feel disappointment, but I never feel despair. And I think sadness and disappointment are appropriate because we do find people that don't listen. And we do find dismissiveness. And sometimes that might creep into our student body and our faculty, not through intent, but through being human and then being a part of some of the structures that bring us to this moment. But being mindful, raising the issues and trying to then be attentive to those issues with different principles in play, different processes in play, don't mean then that I'm just stuck in sadness or disappointment because I see opportunities and alternatives. I have two kind of mantras when I teach, which is beware of the danger of a single story and nuance is sacred. That is, all of the hurt and pain and challenge in the world you will find at the University of Victoria Law School. And we should not mislead anyone that they're coming to a place where it's utopia and it's always a group hug. All of that, which is in broader society, is also at the University of Victoria Law School. But we also have something special at the University of Victoria that, while I love many of my colleagues at other schools and find great things that they're doing there, this degree provides an opportunity to engage in a depth of working through these issues that I haven't found in other places. Although other places are amazing, I can say with some confidence, having taught at different schools around the world and around Canada, that there is a uniqueness in relationship to your question, which helps us to find more of that hope and possibility in the midst of all the garbage that's intermingled with it.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Dana. It's been really inspiring to hear both of you speak today about this program, and it's really, really exciting. I suppose I'm having a little bit of a hard time like narrowing in on my specific question because there are many in my brain right now. But one thing I was wondering about is you spoke of the work of the program in terms of a transsystemic approach in relation to Indigenous law and Crown law. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how you navigate through the complexity of the very many governance and legal systems of each nation. There are so many different approaches and so many different legal orders. What kind of a grounding do students leave with at the end of the program in terms of those differences in the legal orders? And I suppose like two little follow-up questions to that being, Maybe if you could speak a little bit more to the expectations you have for students who will graduate from this program and the types of work that they will do. And slightly unrelated is just what are the lessons that you've learned so far in the program? Because you're in the second cohort now. I'm wondering if there have been changes or lessons through that. Thank you.
Yeah, these are three great questions about lessons learned and the inter-nation challenges that we find. And I'll take the inter-nation question, which is in constitutional law, which I teach, Anishinaabe people have relations with Haudenosaunee people and Dakota people and Cree people, and we have historic treaties with those nations that are sometimes recorded in wampum belts, sometimes they're recorded in big drum ceremonies. And so part of what I try to talk about through the year, although I don't emphasize it as much as I probably could, is the way that the Anishinaabe tradition has learned from the Haudenosaunee or learned from the Dakota, and how that learning occurs despite centuries of war and conflict with the Haudenosaunee and the Dakota 300 years ago, and then perhaps centuries more beyond that. And so that's one dimension of working through the inter-societal, that is the inter-nation points of work. The other is that some of the cases that we study involve questions of overlapping claims, as they're often called. And you'll see how some of the nations are trying to work through those questions. But it is a good reminder that we need to continue to work on those questions as well. And for instance, yesterday I gave a presentation about the Wet'suwet'en issue in relationship to Coastal GasLink, and we talked about the hereditary systems, and we talked about the elected systems, and the work that needs to be done within the nation around that. And I know there's another piece of that, which is the relationship to the Gitxsan and Carrier and others that we're continuing to keep our eye on.
So I'll take a stab at the second question in thinking about what do we expect students, like what skills are they graduating with. It is a 4-year program, and we do expect that we're going to graduate students with a high degree of skill and understanding and caliber around the common law that would enable them to pass the required bar exams and practice and be strong writers, advocates, etc. In terms of Indigenous law, because as you mentioned, they're learning many different legal traditions. Some legal traditions, they'll have more opportunity to engage more fully as they'll take it in more than one course. So there's a mandatory Coast Salish Law and Languages program because of where we are placed within the territory, where students, I also teach Coast Salish Law of Obligations, and it's the hope that one of our field schools will be in Coast Salish Law. So although they'll have it in 3 courses, it's not like a common law degree where you're taking 3 years of only one legal tradition. And so while I always say to my students, I too am a baby learner. My elders would describe themselves as baby learners. Law is something that your legal education within the Coast Salish legal tradition continues even beyond death. So it's never something you become an expert in. But similar to the common law, just as you don't graduate from law school and then can take on cases and run with it, there's still research that requires to be done. All we're hoping is that they graduate with the skills necessary in order to continue and do that work. That then when they go into community and they recognize an Indigenous law issue, they have a good foundation or scaffolding from which to work more directly with that community.
So the part of the question I want to take up on that front as well is that the sky is the limit. This is an approach, a methodology that can be applied internationally. So I see so many analogies in Brexit with what I see in relationship to Indigenous communities trying to work out a better relationship with the state. I see what happens in the southern borders of the United States as they're trying to stop people from coming and figuring out how do cultures and peoples interact on that level. I see things with armed conflict around the world, where Indigenous peoples, the methodologies that we employ here, which is trying to learn across legal traditions and trying to learn across cultures. I hope you could graduate from this program, and if you came from the Ukraine or Italy or South America, you would find that this prepares you to work through problems in a way that is pluralistic and that is attentive to the international dimensions of what is present. And I'm serious about that. You know, at McGill Law School, when you learn the civil law and the common law together, a lot of those students can go off and they can work in many parts of the world, and that's their career aspirations. I do hope that a lot of our students actually work with Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities, and that remains our primary focus. But I don't want to undersell or underemphasize for one moment. This is pitched at another level as well, and there's great benefit that people could learn about being diplomats and engaging in those world conversations. It's not just that there's Indigenous, non-Indigenous issues in other parts of the world. The methodology itself has something to say about that.
Good morning. My name is Susan Bro, and I'm proud to be the Dean of the Faculty of Law. And I just really wanted to address your question because one of my jobs is to talk to law firms, to talk to governments about our programs, and frankly, about employability of our graduates. And I cannot emphasize enough the true excitement provincially, nationally, and internationally about the transsystemic work we're doing here, because John is absolutely right. We are on the forefront of a legal conversation that is global. And the students who graduate from this program are the pioneers in what I believe to be the future of law. That in fact, law is not domestic anymore. That the 21st century lawyer has to be able to engage in that conversation. And so I'm extremely proud to be the dean of a faculty that is doing this groundbreaking work. And I truly believe this is going to make students who graduate from this degree the leaders in the future of legal conversations around the world. Thank you.
So we are running a bit over, I guess, when you have two amazing scholars to answer your questions. Once the ball starts rolling, it keeps going. I know there was another part to that, but we do have to go to coffee break. There were some online questions, so to you folks there on the web, we will answer those via email. I'll just connect with Sarah and John to get to those questions, so thank you for those questions. So at this point, we'll take a 10-minute break. There's coffee, there's some little snacks back there. Anybody who wants to stay for the admissions part of it, we'll have our team here as well as our amicus team to speak about the supports available to students at the Faculty of Law. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes.